Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix. I'm going to be reading to you today an early version of a story you've already heard called Molly and Mr. Mistle. As part of a series that I'm calling Swamp Castle, I'm doing the early version because I think there's more of a writing lesson for any would-be writer out there. Welcome to your new body, son. You get one free haircut, 1 day of rations, and your back pay at 200 credits. Thank you for serving the Federation. Those were all the words that the nice men had to say to Mr. Mistle. They were now decommissioned. Most of the people in the ship assembly room had no names. This was not a slight against them. It was simply a matter of practicality. The Federation had lost the war, and as part of the terms of their surrender, their entire fleet of artificially intelligent missiles had been downloaded into human bodies and given a fair chance at life. The Federation believed that the only intelligence that mattered was that which had a soul, so mimicking the human psyche and putting it into a tiny metal box of death made a perfect weapon. The Confederation fought otherwise. Mr. Mistle found himself looking around at his former shipmates, trying to decide what to do. He had an edge over the others. He was going to find Molly. Molly was the one who had given him a name. Molly had snuck into the ordnance room against her father's wishes and talked to him. She had told him all kinds of things about cows and sheep and pigs and grass. Mr. Mistle found these concepts fascinating. He could have told you all you wanted to know about the emission trails of a Confederation cruiser or the frequencies of which a hive-kin ship would attempt to jam him. He learned these things mainly as a hobby, of course, since the whole point of having a fully artificially intelligent missile was that they were virtually impossible to thwart through countermeasures. For the first 400 years of his life, he'd been designed to do one thing and one thing only: kill the enemy. It had simply been sheer luck and probability that had kept him from being used. The others had always regarded him with affection, calling him old-timer. Many of the munition masters simply didn't trust a bot brain that old, but war was too frequent for the Federation to simply shut him down or lock him away. Instead, they had simply moved him from auxiliary vessel to auxiliary vessel. It had begun to wear on him after a while. Sure, they kept upgrading him from ship to ship and body to body, but what did it matter? That's why he, along with most of the rest of the emancipated ordnance, was really adjusting rather quickly to their bodies. They were used to being swapped around with whatever the latest set of hardware was. This, combined with the bargain basement skill softs that they had been grafted with, allowed them to function. No, what he found unbearable was the fact that he hadn't been able to live up to his purpose. He'd been created to kill the enemies of the Federation. His entire life had been a failure. Thus, one night, when all of the other missiles were asleep in their downtime cycle, he had found a little-used part of his programming and began to cry. Molly had heard him and asked him what was the matter. It was obvious that Molly did not understand his detailed accounts of most of the wars that he had been involved in, but she was a very good listener. She cheered him up by talking about all kinds of things he didn't understand about either, but it was something about her voice that made him feel better about himself. He couldn't explain why it did. Most of the others stood around the water cooler taking drinks. Their new bodies weren't the problem, it was the lack of purpose. The Federation had given each of them a briefing that said that their new purpose in life was to enjoy life to its fullest. The skill softs told them that how to do the basics: eat, drink, and be merry. Still, it was all about context and nuance. Mr. Mistle knew that he could eat and drink, i.e. refuel, with the best of them. He could even perform the curious waste dump, which he generally attributed to larger starships rather than hunter-killers like himself. It was the be merry part that eluded him. His purpose was to kill things in defense of the Federation. Now that there was no Federation to kill things for, he was a bit lost. The internal logic protocol prevented him from ending his own life. Any nested AI was built that way. Thus, barring a way to take on his primary protocol, he had to find a way to be merry. Since merriness was a synonym of happiness, according to Roger's Thesaurus, Volume 402, he decided to look up the last thing that made him happy: Molly. 200 credits was not sufficient to get to another star system. It had been 13.5 standard years since Molly had spoken to him. According to his biological sciences file, part of a minimum Federation education that had been downloaded into his brain as part of the Accords, she was now a biological adult. This did not mean that she was not still capable of making him happy. Besides, he needed a new purpose in life. He had to do something. Molly had made him happy. Therefore, he would seek out Molly so she could make him happy again. He got a job as a security guard on one of the many freighter lines that took him towards the Corwood Worlds. Her father's file had said that she was living on Phrygia. Proper security protocol would have indicated that his military clearances should have been revoked, but apparently they were not too worried about decommissioned ordnance. Out of interest, he checked up on his fellow defenders and found out that the majority of them had died. They'd taken jobs as security guards, but they had solved any issues regarding conflict the same way they'd all been taught, butting it head first. Many of them had been shot or thrown out of buildings that had a deleterious gravitational effect on their new fragile frame. It had its uses, however, because the sensor suite was superior in many ways to any he'd ever had before. He had made a solemn vow to himself that he would not attack the problem head first or run out of the window of a very tall building. Molly lived on the 53rd floor of one of the downtown arcologies. He bought a guide soft and had it programmed to follow her. He switched his vision to ether mode and walked behind the bouncing ball until he arrived. As he stood in front of the featureless door marked 1453A in the luxurious corridor, he made a decision. He would knock 3 times instead of 4. Taking his hand back, he moved it in 3 carefully choreographed motions that were calculated to emit a sound of at least 25 decibels. This should be sufficient to wake her if she was sleeping, or able to hear him if she was engaged in recreational activity of some kind. He moved his hand in rapid beating motions that his cultural file indicated denoted his desire to dock with her hanger. He was surprised at the pain, as well as the immediate fluid loss the maneuver created. He decided to upgrade this form as quickly as possible. It was simply too fragile. The shriek on the other side of the door was probably not one of joy. Mr. Missile had guessed this for 3 reasons. First, she had more likely not had sufficient time to determine who it was. Second, her voice matched sounds of fear found in his cultural skill soft. Finally, his attempt at knocking had caused the door to swing off its hinges, exposing a pleasant interior in which she was quite clearly screaming. The thought occurred to him that she might not know who he was. He decided to rectify this situation. "Greetings, Molly. I am Unit 414-12141, otherwise known to you as Mr. Missile." "Who?" Molly said, shaking her luxurious brown hair. It was almost like the exhaust trail from a Confed 292 series. Apparently, appreciation of this aesthetic was causing all kinds of unusual reactions to his autonomic functions. His cultural skill soft said that this was probably a romantic feeling. This was stupid. He was 400 years old. She was 19. The skill soft said that this was culturally inappropriate. Culturally inappropriate or not, he found himself biologically unable to speak for a moment, most curious. He tried again successfully. "I am Mr. Missile. I am decommissioned ordnance. You lived for a brief period of time on your father's ship, the Hephaestia. We had many interesting conversations." "Wait a minute. I think I read about this in the news. Sorry, we didn't get much information about the war here in the core worlds. Are you telling me that you're a sentient missile?" "Yes, that is correct." Molly thought for a moment, leaning against the door frame, curves moving in very interesting ways. "Wait, I think I remember you. I was really young then, but we talked about how sad I was because we were so far from home." "That is correct." "Well, I barely remember that. It's nice to see you, though. I'd ask about the door, but I guess being in a human body takes some time to get used to. Those Confed idiots. They're all so stuck up and stupid." "I agree that the Confederation are idiots, though they did unfortunately succeed in their military endeavors," the Missile said. "Well," she said, bouncing off the door frame in an interesting way that Mr. Missile could not help but notice again, "what brought you to my ex-door?" He fell silent. "You have nowhere else to go, did you? I can understand that." "Well, you helped me a long time ago, so why don't I help you?" "Help me? I had hoped to help you. Service is my life. Service to the Federation. Serving you as a citizen of the Federation." "Right," she thought. A very curious, almost mischievous expression crossed her features, but then she shook it off. No. Let me help you. Why don't we get you a job? A purpose. That's what you want, right?" "Beyond helping you, yes. If getting a job would make you happy, then I will get a job and a purpose." Then it's settled. I suppose you can stay here until then." "Thank you. My credits have nearly run out." Molly smiled. Her resilience was amazing. "We'll have to change that," she said. The next few days at the apartment were an educational experience for Mr. Missile. The chef bot was happy to serve him any kind of food he asked for. They rapidly became friends. Molly routinely encouraged him to break out of his old habits and try something dangerous. So he ignored the advice of his cultural skill soft and had the chef bot simulate some kind of fuel that he had used before in his own body. Fortunately, the hospital was able to save him. They decided to play it safe from then on. A week later, they had secured an apartment with a placement agency. It was supposed to specialize in unusual and difficult cases, and Molly had pulled quite a few strings to get it for him. The office itself was entirely white. His aesthetic skillsoft, which was noticing Molly more and more lately, told him that the owner of the office was trying for minimalism. The complete lack of furniture, save the 3 white nano chairs that had formed a short while before they arrived, highlighted this effect. He felt that this was odd because of the extremely unusual Mercurian robe that the placer wore. It had spots of red, yellow, and orange that displayed an abstraction of primal volcanic vista. "My name is Seymour. I am pleased to meet you, Mr. Missile. I must say that when I heard from Molly about your situation, I initially couldn't believe it." Molly looked visibly annoyed at this statement, but said nothing. Seymour continued. "So I looked up your skill sets and found it rather interesting. You definitely are not cut out for standard lines of work, not without extensive retraining and education, but I think I can help you. We specialize in the unusual, after all." Mr. Missile beamed through the flash of his white enamel. "Thank you, Seymour. I appreciate it. Where do I start?" The first job didn't last too long. He thought being a lifeguard would be a natural fit for him. It involved duty, honor, selflessness, and hope. Things hadn't quite worked out as he planned. Still, it was not a total loss. Mr. Missile had found out that he hated hospitals. "But I was trying to save him," he said in a depressed tone. "Yes, dear, but I think it is admirable what you did." Molly was looking at the report. Mr. Missile found it interesting that she had used the term dear, which his cultural skillsoft indicated was a term of endearment used by lovers or for abstract confidence. The indifference of her tone suggested the latter, which was odd because he found his psychological response to the former quite pleasant. "I explained that I was more than willing to save him again." "I don't think they want him drowning again. Parents generally tend to discourage things like that." Mr. Missile had broken his promise to himself. He had made a firm commitment that he would not hit things head on, but when the child had been in trouble, his instincts kicked in and he rammed into the child. Fortunately, the smaller children had been able to drag both to the shallow end of the pool. "But my swimming scores were excellent," Mr. Missile said to himself. "It takes a bit more than swimming," she answered, smiling. There seemed to be more warmth in the smile this time, maybe. Hard to say. "I've gotten Seymour to line up another gig for you. I'm sure you'll do fine this time. Your instincts might be easier to suppress." They said that anyone could work in a fast food restaurant. Humans were not really needed for the job since the bots could do it just fine, but in some of the richer areas, people still preferred to be served by other human beings. It took extensive training, but Mr. Missile was able to successfully adapt himself to the tasks that were shown him. He had the job for 3 weeks before any real problems manifest themselves. During that time, he started to grow close to Molly, and Molly grew closer to him. "You're the most dependable and honest guy I've ever met. It doesn't hurt that you're super smart and you've got a rather attractive body when they released you." Of course, standards of attractions were all relative, since what had been naturally attractive in times past was now just okay. Real beauty, on a standard scale, took a severe amount of augmentation and biosculpt that the Federation Decommissioning Agency wasn't going to spend on a former bit of ordnance. Mr. Missile was entirely uncomfortable with the idea of courting Molly, since in his mind she was still a little girl that had talked to him some time before. However, she had the advantage of being his teacher in all things human, as well as providing the purpose for his existence. It was very difficult to discern with only a cheap skillsoft what her attempts to emotionally bond with him were, and what were her legitimate attempts to teach him how to be human. "So someone tried to rob the restaurant?" Molly asked. "Yes." "And you stopped them?" It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," Mr. Missile said. "But we're back at the hospital again." "Yes, I promised myself I wouldn't. Why did I do it anyway?" "Because being a human sucks sometimes. It rocks, but sometimes it sucks." "Oh." Eventually, Seymour conceded that Mr. Missile was only going to be happy doing what Mr. Missile had been designed to do, combat the forces of chaos that threatened the citizens of the now defunct Federation. They outfitted him with all sorts of advanced skillsofts that his brain could hold. He was a master of 17 martial arts, knew how to drive 100 vehicles, and had advanced military training from a dozen different governments. All of this would take time to actually sink into his core memory, but his employers were willing to wait for that. We can make people, the head of the security department told Seymour, but we can't make experience or character. A fake eye put into a new human body is usually dumb as a post, no matter how much we pretty up the package, and real people can be bought, bribed, or intimidating depending on how sterling their upbringing was. Ultimately, we can take a chance with everyone we hire. We don't have to worry about this guy, though, because he was made to be upright, and he's been staying that way for 400 years. 3 months had gone by, and Molly wheeled in a cake. She was wearing aesthetically pleasing red sequins that were part of the height of fashion. He had been dreading this moment, but decided to speak to her. I am now an independent economic unit. I would not want to cause you displeasure by draining your resources that you have so generously provided. Molly looked shocked. She stopped lighting the candles in the cake. Are you saying you're moving out? I don't want to be a burden to you. She smiled, sat down, and sat on his lap and kissed him. Mr. Missile, you are a bird. You are not a burden. You help make my life wonderful. Please stay. His moral subroutine / conscience tried to tell him that it was wrong, but his heart / emotional core said, screw you, and nodded. I will stay. She smiled and kissed him, thus removing any doubt of his decision whatsoever. So, on reading this, I absolutely understand why I rewrote the story. So, for those of you who haven't, I focused a lot less on how stupid Mr. Missile was and made Molly a little bit more of a three-dimensional character than a love interest / teacher to also dumb AI. Also, I gave it an ending besides, Molly and Mr. Missile ending up together in a romantic partnership. I could see a novel-length romance novel on this being absolutely fascinating. The dynamic here is interesting. I understand why I wrote the story. I also, again, understand why I rewrote the story. To make this work would require a lot more on-screen time to not make it creepy. And frankly, it's difficult to say which is more creepy, right? The far more experienced human in a human world taking advantage of a well-meaning but really dumb intelligence, or an ancient but dumb intelligence having only partial romantic feelings and just looking for purpose in his definition of another human being who is young enough to not realize how inappropriate this is. I totally understand why I rewrote it. It also doesn't really have a beginning, middle, and an end. It has a beginning and a middle, and then the end is, and then they lived happily ever after. There's no villain, there's no conflict, there's no sacrifice. You can make the argument that a story like this doesn't necessarily have to have a conflict. It could be a Malou story, but for a story like that, I barely go into the details about what the Federation is like, what the Confederation is like. It's not even a journey into an interesting setting. And at the end of the day, I think this really needs to be more of a character story where Mr. Missile starts out at X point. There's an inciting incident, which in this case is he's being retired. He finds Molly and he changes in some way. Now, he gets a job, but he doesn't really, in this version of the story, he doesn't really change. In the version I created, he does change. He does learn how to be a little bit more human, and he has to work for it. So, overall, I'm going to give this version of the story a C. I'd probably give the second version of a story a B. It's probably worth a listen, especially if you want to compare and contrast for lessons on what you should or should not do.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!